I don't know a great number of Bible passages. One of my favorites has to be Matthew 7, 1 through 5, and yes, I had to look that up. It says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." It's such a powerful metaphor for a nearly universal tendency. It's so much more fun to point out other people's shortcomings than it is to actually deal with our own. For the past month or so, I had been nagging my boyfriend, Ryan, to make an appointment with his financial planner to get some questions answered about financial questions. And yes, I said nagging. I've been nagging him, even giving him verbatim questions to ask. Finally, it dawned on me that part of my motivation was distracting from my own reality. I was way, way past due for looking at my own financial details. Truth be told, I hate dealing with those things. Not because they're terrible or because I'm financially irresponsible. Things are really okay. And I always feel better after I pull back the cover to see what's going on. Looking at the numbers just seems so daunting. And it's so easy to look the other direction. So today, as we continue this month's theme of justice, we're talking about the importance of actual data. Since we're collecting data, let's have a quick question, a quick poll by hands. The wealth disparity around the world is truly nauseating. How many of us are disgusted by the tiny, insignificant amount that many billionaires give to charity issues? And how many of us know the actual percentage of our own annual budget that we give to charitable causes? I figured a few of you would. That's impressive, because I do not. But it is more comfortable to point fingers. Last week, in honor of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Day, I told some really powerful stories about unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. And I could continue in that theme and share more stories about today's justice leaders. But the plural of anecdotes is not data. While stories are powerful motivators, they are not the only way of understanding what's going on in the world. We need to look at some actual measurements too. You may be thinking, I thought this was a sermon. This is a faith community, right? Why is he talking about data? But even in our spiritual pursuits, we attend to material things. All around the world, various cultures embrace particular physical practices. They build buildings or reconstruct their buildings after floods. They memorize words to say. They chant or they sing. They attend to the material world in all these ways so that they can achieve a goal that is beyond words or measurement. And so it is with justice. Who can give a succinct definition of exactly what justice is? Or who can define beloved community in a couple of sentences? These concepts are squishy at best. So we look at more material things to understand the situation and to measure progress. And justice isn't our only UU value that requires looking at numbers. You might remember our fifth principle talks about honoring and promoting the democratic process in our congregations and society at large. Votes have to get counted. That value is clearly requiring numbers. Another value that we name explicitly is science. Whether out in space or in microbes or even in psychology, science is useless without some measurements and some numbers attached. That is a necessary ingredient to some of our highest values. We don't think about it much. Looking at data, clear, measurable facts is a great way to understand what our world looks like right now. It's also a helpful way of setting goals. Now, this is still January. We might still be considering some goals or resolutions for the new year. Perhaps you want to get more fit. Perhaps you want to spend more time with family, or traveling, or reading books. That all begs the question, what is the current reality? What are the health statistics? The amount of time actually spent with family or reading books? And how much less or more are we aiming for that matter? And when? When do we want to be this happier, healthier, more educated person? For the goal to be worth anything, it needs to be smart. I've been working with some of Tapestry's committees to build more specific goals, and I have unabashedly borrowed from the corporate world to start talking about SMART goals. If you haven't heard this, it's an acronym. It's incredibly useful. SMART goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. It's all very logical, but the SMART acronym wraps up goal setting in a brilliant way. Goals for people or for organizations should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. The piece of that we're zooming in on today is measurable. Now, the rest of this sermon is going to dive into a lot of specific data and numbers. Don't get too hung up about remembering any of those details. There won't be a test. And if you would like to have more of this information, I'm glad to share the text of the sermon with anyone. Today's sermon was inspired in part by a comment that I heard during the focus group on Eighth Principle. The comment was something like, "You can't measure racism." We sort of can. I want to give you some of those measurements. In 2021, the typical white household had 9.2 times as much wealth as the typical black household in America. 9.2 times as much wealth. White households also had about 5.1 times as much wealth as Hispanic households. Also in 2021, infant mortality rate was more than twice as high among black babies as it was for white. That's 10.6 per thousand for black and 4.4 per thousand for white babies. Hispanic and American Indians were about halfway between the two. In 2022, white 25 to 29-year-olds, so let's just say young adults, were 60% more likely than their black counterparts to have a bachelor's degree. Whites are 82% more likely than Hispanic peers to have a bachelor's degree. The home ownership rate for white Americans in 2021 was 72.7%, but the ownership rate for black Americans was 44%. Home ownership rate for Asian Americans was 62%, and for Hispanics it was 50%. Now, looking at one of these statistics alone, we might be able to point to a cultural difference or some historical glitch, but together, they tell a story of historic, ongoing patterns of profound inequity in the United States. To be fair, I suspect the person in this focus group, when they said you can't measure racism, was referring to an individual's personal racial bias. Now, that may be a little more difficult, but I have found that we can actually measure that too. For those who are willing, there are free online assessments that are available. Psychologists at Harvard, University of Virginia, and University of Washington, this isn't a fly-by-night thing, this is legit, together created a series of online assessments called implicit association tests. You can test yourself about all sorts of biases, including race, gender, religious bias, body shape bias, disability, skin tone, and several other categories. The purpose of finding those out isn't to blame others or to blame ourselves. The purpose could be to mark progress. As we learn and become more comfortable about this beautiful, wildly diverse world, we can actually measure personal growth if we're willing. To bring this question of measuring justice a little closer to home, I want to talk a little bit about the impact that Tapestry has made on our wider world. I've always been proud of the stories that I hear here and there about things that have happened, but this week I sat down and collected some of those numbers. We have a lot of newcomers today. I promise this isn't like the bragging Sunday. This was a sincere curiosity of myself. Connie mentioned Welcoming Neighbors Home earlier. That's Tapestry's initiative to advocate for affordable housing and to prevent homelessness. They've been encouraging cities and counties to pass policies to make housing more affordable and to prevent harassment of people without homes. So in the past 4 years, Welcoming Neighbors Home has sparked 500 public comments to city councils or county boards of supervisor on the housing and homelessness issue. They're now working with 7 other nonprofits and have trained close to 40 local people to be advocates for affordable housing in English and in Spanish. In the same arena, they're working to ensure that people on economic margins have enough food to eat. A effort associated with them called Community Loaves is a bunch of volunteer bakers. They're 8 home bakers, as a matter of fact, 3 of whom are from Tapestry. They've baked and donated 115 loaves of bread this year and 650 energy cookies that are nutrient dense for the food pantry just around the corner. A team of volunteers associated with Tapestry also delivers hot meals to the shelter in Laguna Beach for about 40 people once a month. This is a program that's been going for years now, several years. That's 480 hot meals cooked every year, a group that's making a difference. FOCD has always had some statistics that blow us away. That's Friends of Orange County Detainees. Over their, I'm going to say 10 to 12 years of active visitation, they made 10,222 visits to people in immigration detention. The organization supported in some way or another 4,180 immigrants from 105 different countries. 97.6% of them were people of color. Peggy did the math this week. Since COVID hit, FOCD's visitation has shrunk dramatically, but we're still helping young people who age out of detention who came as minors. These are 18-year-olds who are basically booted out of the system. To date, they picked up 91 kids. It's an average of about 1 per week. 2 Tapestry members are kind of making this happen at this point. Another one of our organizations, or another one of our committees, I should say, Women's Rights Action Group does a wide array of activities for all sorts of support of women. I want to share with you a few of their numbers. In 2021, they hosted a donation drive for I Support the Girls, a women's health organization. That month, I'm going to say, the drive went over. They donated $878 from the Sharing Our Gifts collection. They gave 113 bras, 438 pairs of underwear. 1,130 tampons, and 3,264 pads. These are concrete impacts making a difference in women's lives. Their 2023 collection for Silverado Pantry was even bigger. They collected 65 packages of pads, 27 packages of tampons, a bunch of shampoo, a bunch of conditioner, 50 toothbrushes, and 192 bars of soap. That same year, they donated full Thanksgiving dinners for 4 families. Big, generous, great dinners. Of course, you hear every Sunday we talk about the sharing our gifts. I did a little counting up of that this month as well, or this week. I figured we share about $8,000 annually with other organizations through the Sharing Our Gifts program. I wanted to figure out what types of organizations those were. I tried to quantify it, but the types had too much overlapping in the what the organizations did. But by far and away, it's clear that we give the most to organizations that support people on the economic margins here in Orange County, particularly like right here in our neighborhood, which is amazing. Other organizations include supporting women, alleviating local poverty, caring for the environment, supporting LGBT liberation, caring for animal friends, serving and advocating for people of color and immigrants, sending global relief issues, and funding health research. $8,000 annually is not bad. It's also worth putting into context that that's among about 145 members and an operating budget of over $300,000 here at Tapestry. We also have some pretty staggering statistics of what people are doing to green their own lives. Carol put those together, and I'm going to email those out, and they might inspire even more action. I've often heard it said that budgets are a moral document. It should reflect the things that are most important to us. And I know life coaches and finance gurus encourage everyone to take a close look at their personal budget. It's kind of gone out of fashion, but for a long time there was all of that, like, save the $2 from your coffee and put it toward a down payment on your house, or retire a year earlier, or whatever the goal was. The target of these personal budget checks is almost always to reduce spending. And ecologically, that's probably a good idea. We might also think of our personal budget as checking that our spending aligns with our biggest values and our biggest goals. A close look at finances might lead us to cutting some waste. It probably would in my case. Or it might lead us to investing more in organizations that are doing what's important to us in the world. I know that's not fun. I started this sermon talking about my own reluctance to look at finances. Our personal budget, though, is probably the most straightforward and potentially the most impactful metric to look at in measuring justice on a personal level. But there are other things that we can count. I realized, I think for the first time this week, environmental impact is probably the easiest thing to count because it's quantifying actual material things in the world that we use. We might ask, how many meals per week include meat? Or how many meals are vegan? How many gallons of gas do you put in your car? Or how many miles do you drive? I think electric drivers can forget that driving an electric car still has a pretty big impact. How many miles do you fly per year? How many single-use disposable items do you use in a week? That's the question that terrifies me. No one's going to keep track of all of that. But tracking one that you really care about could be interesting. How we show up for social justice issues is a little more difficult to quantify, but it can be done. The most obvious thing that comes to mind is about budget that I was talking about earlier. How much of it goes to the things that you actually care about. But I did a social media poll to find some other ways of measuring these things in our personal lives. Some that came up: how many friends do you have that are people of color? For that question, a friend counts as someone who is close enough to you to talk to you about their experience without a lot of prying. How many friends of another gender do you have? Similarly, these are friends that will talk honestly with you about their experience. Of the first 100 names in your phone directory, how many of them are queer, or people of color, or people with disabilities? That's very measurable. How many different news sources do you check regularly? How many books by or about people of color have you read in the past year? This list is nowhere near exhaustive. These are just examples of numbers that we could look at month over month, year over year. I see some of your brains churning, wondering what number might be. I'll put these questions and probably a few more in the February newsletter, so they're out there to look at. The point is to start paying attention, not just casually, but specifically. Inequality is not a mystery. It is a real and measurable thing. Aligning ourselves with building beloved community is also not a mystery. There are concrete, measurable opportunities. So I want to challenge you/us to a little homework, which means I now have to go home and do these things too. I want to challenge us to look at two personal measures of justice. Pick one that you are curious about from a numbers perspective. That could be because it's really easy to count and accessible, or just an odd thing to quantify. And pick one that is especially important to you. Whatever injustice stirs your soul or keeps you up at night, look at a real metric of your own behavior that relates to that issue. Now, no one's going to judge what is enough. There will be no public shaming or gold stars, unfortunately, because I know many of you need some gold stars. It's just about checking in with reality so that we can grow toward justice together. Amen.